juha, saatsi.
Yeah, it's the way
And we will have to build against it more for idealization and still realist commitment, so we will get further clarification on the subject. So thank you very much for your contribution, and go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much for inviting me and organizing this very nice event. We'll see how much clarity we get. Hopefully we'll get some thinking done. We'll get some thinking done anyway on this topic. So here's the structure of the talk. Well, first of all, lay out the question that's the question I'm interested in, which has to do with this notion of realist commitment. What our epistemic commitments should be to predictably successful bits of science. And then in section 2, I covered some existing accounts of idealization, and I complain that those accounts do not really throw much light on this question that I'm interested in. And then in section 3, I'm going to have a little bit of fun with these intuitions I've got about a different way of thinking about how false bits of theorizing can latch onto reality. It's a little bit, as I said, I'm going to have fun with this for example I've got, and maybe not we'll get to section 12 and the sort of realist spirits that I'm trying to advocate more generally. So okay, here's the introduction. So I'll talk about models and inferences in the context of scientific realism. Scientific realism debate is often presented in relation to theories. So you have well-known challenges to scientific realism as an epistemological thesis, this idea that we get to know what the unobservable world is like in its key features by having approximately true theories or theories that are possibly true or something like that. You have well-known challenges to that, and often those are presented in relation to theories. So you have radical theory changes in the history of science. You go from Newtonian gravity to general theory of relativity or classical Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics or what have you. People talk about this problem of underdetermination of theories by data, and it's often discussed in very general terms in relation to theories. And of course you have well-known realist responses to that, which, roughly speaking, in the abstract, say that, well, despite these problems, predictably successful theories can be taken to latch onto reality in some critical respects. They are approximately true, or they're very similar, or something like that. And often the debate, as I said, is conducted in relation to theories. Now, but if you think of it, much of the debate can be conducted in the context of models as well. Why? We can shift the focus to models because, in as far as scientific realism is motivated by this idea that we have some really impressively accurate and sometimes even impressively novel predictions from science, those predictions are provided often with, by models. It's the models that make, say, Newtonian mechanics predictably accurate. And as we heard yesterday, many philosophers think that theories are nothing but collections of models. Families of models, not any old families. These are families of models that are naturally unified by the laws that we then take to be the theories. So given that theories are nothing but models, we can really think of models as the law of the realism debate. And the challenges presented themselves also in connection with models in similar ways. So whereas in theories you have inconsistencies, say, diachronic inconsistencies over the history of science, you have various kinds of inconsistencies in the context of models. And of course inconsistencies, unless you think that the reality itself is inconsistent, you think that, well, when you have inconsistencies in science, there's some falsehood involved, and that presents some sort of prima facie challenge to realism. So idealizations, for example, are at odds with our background beliefs about the world. Sometimes they are radically at odds with our background beliefs about the world. In as far as those idealizations can lead to impressive predictive success, this kind of no-ripples intuition gets started, and you want to say something about how those falsehoods get involved in the production of those predictions. You have mutually inconsistent models, so you have, say, the liquid drop model or the shell model of the atomic nucleus, which are radically mutually inconsistent. assumptions. You have some models that are internally inconsistent and so on. So there's a challenge to realism. Now, some people have discussed this challenge to realism in connection with models, not too many. Here's just one example. So these are recent paper by Roy Sorensen. The quote from him, so he presents in somewhat simplistic terms, but he presents the challenge as follows. Idealization appears to challenge realism because scientists wittingly employ false assumptions to explain and predict. Falsification in the sense of incorporation of falsehoods into our theorizing is counterproductive in the pursuit of truth. So scientific realism appears to imply that idealization would be worse than ineffective. Well, that's strongly put, but that's the sort of idea that somehow idealization is pulling to the opposite direction from what the realist would think. By contrast, the instrumentalist says that scientists are merely aiming at prediction and control phenomena, given that scientists are indifferent to the truth and often believe idealization will promote prediction and control. The instrumentalist predicts that scientists should idealize or will idealize. Hence, idealization looks like a crucial experiment in philosophy of science. Since scientists, as a matter of fact, do idealize, instrumentalism prevails and realism is challenged. Now, in the paper, Sorensen goes on to present an account of idealization that is meant to answer this challenge. I think he's unsuccessful in doing that, but that's basically the challenge that I'm interested in, and I'll go through some responses to that. Okay. What are those responses? Well, in the abstract, they all take the following form, the same thing as the realists want to say in relation to these challenges from historical theory chains and so on. So models, in some sense, latch on to unalterable reality, regardless of the kinds of inconsistencies and falsehoods that the models incorporate. Okay. That's the basic intuition. So that somehow there's a principled sense in which predictive success is due to these models latching onto reality. It's not due to the falsehoods that are being, it's not due to falsehoods being in and of themselves somehow instrumentally useful. And that principled sense is somehow meant to then underwrite realist commitments, so that when we have an idealized model, we are meant to have this kind of commitment towards that model underwritten by this principled sense that we use to explain the predictive success of an idealized model. Okay. It's meant to give us some sort of justified confidence for taking the predictive success as some sort of valuable indicator of theoretical progress made by those models in terms of them latching on to unalterable reality. Now, obvious question here. What do we mean by latching onto reality? What is that? How do we precisify that sort of metaphorical notion of latching onto reality? And different realists say different things about it. Okay. How do we articulate reality latching to capture the relevant features of modeling and realist intuitions? How do we, the business at stake is all about that. Okay, that's the question I'm interested in. Okay. Clear intuition, very unclear notion. And it's very difficult to say exactly what this reality latching should amount to. People have to say very different things. So you might look into the verisimilitude literature, very large literature on approximate truth or truth likeness, verisimilitude, per se, Ilkka Niiniluoto, Finnish philosopher of science, thinks that idealizations can be understood from that perspective. Other people in connection with the semantic view think that personal structures and quasi-truth can do the work, very different perspective. Sorensen himself thinks that idealization should be understood as suppositional. Some people talk of fiction. Most recently, Arnold Levi has said that Yablo's theory of personal truth can do the work. Okay. Here's a general worry about all the approaches I've seen in the literature so far. In as far as I can see, these responses that people have made to the challenge that I just presented, they don't really account or illuminate how a degree of empirical adequacy is achieved by these idealized models. And I'm unable to get a good handle on this realist explanation of predictive success from models that incorporate perhaps indispensably these falsehoods. And my project is to try and think further and in different ways how one could capture this latching onto relation so as to really illuminate the sense in which a model that indispensably incorporates falsehoods is responsible not by virtue of those falsehoods, but by virtue of the latching onto reality relation. So that's the project. Okay, second section. We've done with the intro. So let's move on to some of these accounts. So I'm briefly going to cover just it's an exposition of the different things that have been said, and just reiterating my worry that these theories don't really illuminate much how idealized models are pretty successful. So just one example, a lovely colleague of mine, Stefano, an advocate of the semantic view, he, with Newton da Costa and James as well, have done a good deal of work on this so-called parcel structures version of the semantic view. And the idea is, I'm not going to say anything about what these parcel structures are and what this notion of parcel isomorphism is. It's a formal notion that you can develop essentially in set theoretic model theory that allows you to have a degree of leeway between your models and, say, data models. And the claim is that, to quote, idealization and approximation-based essential science can be accommodated nicely through the introduction of these parcel isomorphisms. So isomorphism is too rigid a notion, but this parcel isomorphism is flexible enough to accommodate naturally idealization and approximation as the fundamental relationship horizontally and vertically between different theoretical models and theoretical data models. And then furthermore, they develop this notion of quasi-truth, which then is meant to capture in formal terms, kind of an extension of the Tarskian notion of truth, that is meant to capture in formal terms this idea that idealization can be regarded as if they were true. And it's meant to be a formalization of that intuition that scientists often have. Now, my worry is that I simply am unable to see how this existence of a parcel isomorphism or parcel homomorphism between, say, a given data model and some model of a theory, how that throws light on this latching onto reality so as to see how the latching onto reality is responsible for the given predictive success. I just don't see how the appeal to parcel isomorphisms, how the formal framework in and of itself says anything about the role of falsehood in these idealized models. Maybe I'm missing something here, but I just don't quite see how it's illuminating the question at stake. How can the realist brackets the falsehood as useful, perhaps even indispensable, but still somehow falling outside the realist commitment? So as far as I can see, the existence of parcel isomorphism or homomorphism is simply quiet about that, and I think Stephen actually thinks more or less the same, because he thinks that this formal framework can be equally works for an empiricist and a realist. So it's not really developed in support of realism in the first place. Okay. Now here's a very different idea. So the range of ideas, the range of things people have said about idealization and this latching onto idea is really rather broad. So here's a very different idea. Let's start with this common idea that, quoting Weisberg, that idealization is somehow the intentional introduction of distortion into scientific theory. So it's intentional in the sense that you know already when you're putting the distortion in place that it indeed is a distortion. Okay. Now you can ask, okay, intentional introduction of distortion, in what sense? In what sense are we intentionally distorting the targets, the features of the target market? Well, people say very different things about that. They say that, well, you can understand this intentional introduction in the sense of being indirectly asserting something true. So, Michael Strevens, for example, says things like that. So if you think of distorting, you have an inclined plane, some friction on it, the friction is negligible. So you know that, it's true that the friction is negligible, and you assert that by idealizing and putting it to zero. So you're asserting something true, but you're doing it kind of in a roundabout way. Very different thing said by Mirafiori, who says that, well, one has to be a perspectivalist about models and the way they latch onto reality, and it's a kind of a relativized assertion that's going on. It's relative to one's perspective. Magnani said that you are asserting in a kind of a temporary sense, in a way that you are referring to future, at least potential possibility of de-idealizing. You are saying that, yeah, friction is zero, but in principle at least you de-idealize and have some small term, and then that would give you a more prediction. Some people say that it's a question of pretension. You are pretending that it's as if, and you get into the fiction literature here. You know, people talk about assertion. Now, here's a very different idea. Sorensen says, yeah, forget about assertion. You're not asserting anything. Rather, instead of assertion, what you have is something much more akin to conditional proof. You don't have any kind of attenuated assertion. What you have, rather, is that, okay, you just suppose, it's a supposition, you suppose P, and then you show that from P you get Q, and then you conclude that if P then Q. So Sorensen's idea is this. We can model idealization as, well, if we model idealization as figuring as a premise of a purely esoteric proof, then the idealization will take on the air of a lie or fiction or metaphor or something even less well understood. That's not nice. Happily, idealization, however, is an instance of something that logicians understand well. It's a supposition that initiates conditional proof and or rather reductio ad absurdum. Okay, so idealization, that's his theory of idealization, is constituted by supposition. Only simplified suppositions count as idealization, but the filters are psychological and methodological. Idealizers seek tractability, memorability, and transmissibility. Okay. Well, that's one view of idealization. Now, in as far as the question at stake is concerned, this question that Sorensen himself presents at the beginning of his paper, the one I quoted at length, the one of trying to make sense from the realist perspective of how idealized models are predicted as successful, I don't really see how the philosophy of language approach is doing any useful work here. To begin with, even with respect to capturing idealizations, I find it very coarse-grained. I just don't see how this kind of philosophy of language / logic approach really helps us capture, for example, the crucial differences between different kinds of idealizations, between, say, Galilean de-idealizable idealizations and idealizations that are indispensable in a very strong sense. I just don't see how saying that the propositions involved in idealizations have the stage of being esoteric or suppositional and so on really throw any light on those kinds of issues. And more importantly, regarding the question at stake, for me, I just don't see how, for instance, the philosophy of language accounts, how it accounts for the ways in which idealized models lead to predicted success by virtue of Ladyman's reality. I just don't see how we understand at all that by saying that, okay, these are suppositional proofs where we don't assert the idealizations, but just suppose it, and then we show that, well, if the friction is zero, then it's not really helping me in any way. Okay. Furthermore, just in terms of the spirit of the whole account, and I think this is wrong with many of these views, I don't really see why the realist account of predictive success, this account of latching onto reality, so to make sense of the predictive success of these models, why it should differ if you are dealing with intentional falsehood and if you're dealing with mistaken assertions. So say you have a model where you don't idealize. You don't idealize in the sense of knowing that you are misrepresenting your target. You firmly believe that the target is in a certain way. Now, lo and behold, you are predictably successful, and it later turns out that your model incorporates some falsehoods. The question is just the same. There's no difference in the attitude taken by the scientists, whether or not these aspects of misrepresentation are intentional or not. The challenge is just the same. In both cases, it seems that the natural thing for the realist is just to look at a target as represented by the model, and look at the target as you think it really is, and see how the two relate, and say something about that, say something about latching onto reality in relation to how the two relate to each other. So in a way, you can bracket many of these issues having to do with idealization altogether when you are answering this question. Okay. Now, taking a lot of time there. Here's yet another very different view on idealization. So making connections to some of the talks yesterday, quite a few people have made reference to Kendall Walton's work on these games of make-believe and pretense and so on in connection with models. They think that's a good way of throwing light on idealization. So what Walton says, the key thing to sort of bear in mind when one thinks about these fictionalist approaches is that actually what Walton says about these games of make-believe is broader than just what he says about fiction. So here's an example that Walton gives. He says that, well, where in Italy is the town of Crotone? I don't know how to Crotone. That's an idealization. Crotone. Where in Italy is the town of Crotone, I asked. You explain that it is on the arc of the Italian boat. It is not just for the sake of games of make-believe that we do so, rather the make-believe is useful for articulating, remembering, and communicating facts about crops, for example, the geography of Italy. This doesn't really have to do anything with friction. It's a much broader notion at stake. Now, recently, in this forthcoming paper by Arno Levi in Philosophical Studies, he has paid attention to this, and he says that these fictionalist accounts of models and idealizations have put too much emphasis on this notion of fiction somehow as an intermediary thing between the modeler and the target. Instead, he says, I treat models as games of crop-oriented make-believe in the sense of Walton, where the crops are the real-world targets, okay? So when you're talking, saying that Crotone is in the arch of the Italian boat. You are really talking about, you're presenting Italy in a certain way, okay? Models are special descriptions which portray a target as simpler or just a difference than it actually is. The goal of this special mode of description is to facilitate reasoning about a target. Now, this is the critical bit. Modeling doesn't involve an appeal to an imaginary concrete entity. You don't have to think of this fictional thing which would be concrete goods if it existed or something like that. There's no need to think about sort of imaginary intermediary over and above the target. All we have are targets imaginatively described. Okay, so his paper is entitled Modeling Without Models, meaning that you don't have these models as an intermediary fictional entities that many of these fictionalists like Roman Frege and Thun appeal to. Now I think that's very good. That's nice. If you want to appeal to Walton's theory in this connection, that's probably a good way to go. Okay. Now, what Levi says on the topic of our present interest, this notion of how models latch on to reality, he appeals to Stephen Yablow's recent work on aboutness and partial truth. So Levi says that, yeah, there's this question for the realist to make sense of how models latch onto reality, and I think that the bearing of models, so this is Levi speaking, I think the bearing of models on the world can be accounted for in terms of partial truth then being understood in this specific sense, as developed by Yablow. And the idea is that while the model descriptions are typically idealized, and hence not true of their target's simplicity, they are nevertheless partly true, at least when successful. Now, partial truth of a sentence or collection of sentences, so there's a propositional notion, is understood as truth of a part of the sentence, where this last claim can be then given a nice formal gloss by following Yablow, which says basically that partial truth comes out as follows. So there's a theory to make precise, basically a theory that appeals to possible worlds, and it's kind of a moral semantics, or kind of semantics for partial truth, which involves this notion of subject matter. None of the details really matter for us. let's move on to the worry. So the same worry, I think, and maybe stuff that you can get out of this application of Yablow's notion to modeling. And I have this worry that in as far as Levi has made use of this and has tried to say something about how idealized models are successful and briefly, he hasn't really illuminated in any way the question at stake. So first of all, there are two things. First of all, it's really unclear how Walton's ideas about fiction and proxy-plotted games of make-believe are at all related to this notion of post-truth. I mean, the two seem completely independent from one another. It's not clear at all what Levi says about Walton's theory of fiction being applied to models, how that's relevant in any way to the analysis of post-truth idealized models. That's the first thing. Secondly, and more relevantly for us, I don't see at all how it helps to account for the predicted success of a false model, say from a realist perspective, to say that, okay, some of the propositions involved in modeling, some of the propositions that you say in presenting the model or using it to derive a prediction are personally true in Yablow's sense. I just don't see how that's, in and of itself, how that in any way illuminates the question at stake. Of course, what would matter is the exact ways they are personally true, but Levi doesn't in any way analyze the different ways in which the propositions involved in modeling can be personally true and how some of the ways would then be illuminating of predicted success. He just say that, they're personally true with appeal to this whole thing. Okay, so let me just remind you of the gist of the worry. So this is the gist of the worry. Everybody basically agrees with Rongieri, with this idea that idealization and approximation are the essence of science, empirical science. Okay, and inadequate theory of science and models to reflect this fact in its most basic concepts. More or less everybody agrees on that sentiment. Now here's a worry. This is basically the gist of my worry in the abstract. Fair enough, partial isomorphisms, partial truth in the sense of Yablo and so on, they do reflect this fact that there's certain distance between what a model say the world is like and the world itself. But they don't, reflecting it itself isn't enough. It's not enough to have something in your theory of science that corresponds to the kind of leeway that you have between models and theory. What you need rather is an account. You need something that gives us an understanding of why the falsehoods, even if they are indispensable to modeling, are not responsible for the successes, but rather it's the reality matching that's responsible. And the existing accounts don't do the accounting, they don't give us the understanding. So I take that to be the sort of motivation to go further and try to think about what it would take to have understanding of why idealized models latch onto reality despite the falsehoods that they incorporate. So let me now, and I don't really have an answer to this, unfortunately, but so let me now have some fun with some intuitions that I'd like to push further. Some intuitions that I find very appealing myself. See what you think. So this is a little bit sort of conceptual and hand-waving places. But let's see what you make of this. The general point, first of all, before I get to the hand-waving. Here's a general point. There are various questions specifically about idealizations, and much of the literature kind of mixes up the specific questions about idealizations and this question about how idealized models latch onto reality. I myself like to keep them separate. Okay? I think that the challenge that's stake for the realist, even when you are talking about idealized model, isn't really specifically about idealization. It's really, the question is this: how can a model that is false in this way, so you present a model, it incorporates an idealization, you say that the model is wrong in this way, there's a thermodynamic limit where you take a limit to infinity, the number of particles falls to infinity, you know. The model is false clearly in this way. How can a model of that sort be predictably successful or perhaps explanatorily successful in that way? That's the challenge. You can present the challenge completely independently of this word idealization. You just point to the falsehoods and you point to the success and you ask, how does that work? And you can ask the same question, even if there's no idealization involved. You can ask the same question. Well, here's a model that scientists thought were true in those respects. It turned out not to be, a kind of a case of pessimistic induction or something like that. You can ask the same question. Idealization in and of itself is not involved in any way in this very basic problem. Okay? And I don't think the realist response to this challenge really vary in any way depending on the source of the rich sensational inaccuracy at play, whether it's intentional simplification or whether it's simply erroneous assumption. So for the rest of the talk, I don't really talk about idealizations because they aren't really an issue here. The issue is the idea that you have a model that is false in some respects, empirically successful in some other respects, and you want to make a connection between the two that allows you to understand why, what's responsible for those successes. Okay, so here's the hand-wavy bit where I'm going to have a bit of fun. So, here's the target, this kind of graph, or maybe something represented by the graph. So you have 6 nodes, it's a regular graph, and there's a model. Okay, maybe you present the model by saying that, well, the nodes are located here and they're connected in this way. Everything you say about the model when you present it might be false. The locations of the nodes are, you say falsehoods about those. You say falsehoods about the specific relations. And the question is, okay, you end up with this. That's your model. Now, does your model in some respects latch onto reality? Latch onto the target? A very natural intuition, you look at that, very natural intuition is to say that, okay, well, that falsehoods, so for example, the number of nodes, you have 4 instead of 6. Okay, so that's wrong. What you have, though, is the case that every node is connected. There are 3 edges coming to every node. So it's a regular tree graph. Well, it latches onto that feature of that graph. It's exactly true about that feature of that graph. Okay? So now imagine, and this is purely conceptual, it's nothing to do with some actual model or anything like that. Just imagine that you have this kind of case of local undetermination. So you have some laws, you have some background beliefs about laws at stake, and it's the case that even those laws, even those background beliefs, different modeling assumptions give you empirical success, give you predictive success. The target is like that. How do you present it in like that? And how do you appeal to the laws of nature? The prediction would have gone out. The same applies to this. Okay? It's just simply the case that even the laws, even the nature of the laws, even the relevant regularities at stake, it's irrelevant for the predictive success whether or not you go with this sort of regular tree graph or that sort of regular tree graph. Okay? It's undetermined, case of undetermination, local undetermination. Okay? Now, in what should we say? In what sense does the model latch onto reality? Or maybe the target is like that. So instead of this, it could be like that. It's the other regular tree graph in 6 down and 2. Okay? Now, there's a sense in which, intuitively I like to think, there's a sense in which the 3 graphs are all exactly similar. They share the same property of being regular 3 graphs, less than 8 nodes. Now, in what sense does the false model latch onto reality? Well, yes, that's feature right. Let's try and make something out of that intuition. So how do we what sort of conceptual framework could we get off the ground by running with that sort of intuition? Let's go with the following. The model, it latches onto this critical, less specific feature of the target. Namely, the target has 4 or 6 nodes. That's one of the features it says of the target. Okay? So it's true of this, that it has 4 or 6 nodes. It's true of that it has 4 or 6 nodes. Okay? So this gets right, effectively, the less specific property of having 4 or 6 nodes. Okay? Where do we get to that? Now, it's a less specific feature of the target, also shared by, so these two, of course, shared the same. I claim, just for the sake of the argument, that given the laws of nature, getting this less specific feature is right is all that matters for the predictive success. Let's go with that. Let's assume that. Okay, so the model latches onto these features of reality. So you have some background beliefs, some laws that you don't really think of as modeling assumptions. There's the tree regularity of the graph, and the less specific modeling assumption regarding the number of nodes. Okay. It latches onto those. So I'd like to say, so the intuition of course is to say that, yeah, the model is predictably successful by virtue of latching onto a specific feature of the world that really matters, okay? The obvious worry, the less specific feature is somehow this disjunctive property for all such nodes. What do we think of disjunctive properties of the Goodman? Like what? I have the property of being here or being an ice cube. You know how to generate this. Right? It's we all having the main disjunctive properties. So in disjunctive properties, in what sense can we attribute such a property to the target? Does it make any sense to say that it's a feature that we can, in some sense, be committed to as realists, or it's a feature that we can speak of being true of the target? Now the response, I think, would be to say that it's the relevant laws that underwrite the significance of this specific property. It's not the case that any of these junctions will do as a bona fide, genuine, scientifically respectable feature that you can commit yourself to. Despite you have this kind of vague character or abstract character to this property, in this case the disjunctive feature, from a scientific point of view, given my assumptions, it seems that it can be a genuine bona fide feature of the world, because it is simply the case that given the laws, given the relevant laws, both modeling assumptions would yield the same result. So in a sense you can say that we latch onto a model truth. You can say that it's a model truth about the world that we latch onto. Had there been 4 as opposed to 6 nodes in the target, that's part of reality, or with 3 edges connecting, so regular graph structure back. So the same result would have ensued given the relevant laws of nature. It's a model. You keep the relevant laws of nature fixed, and it's a model truth that you latch onto. Okay. And that's what I like to say that you have, or when you have something like that, then you have a model that's inferentially vertical. Okay. When you're modeling, you don't have to realize that the less specific feature that matters is this disjunctive number of nodes. You don't have to realize that. That's a feature of the world and the model. Okay. And the idea would be that hopefully at least some idealizations can be, some falsehoods in modeling can be captured in such a way that we can say that they are inferentially vertical. Okay. And that's meant to be explanatory, or give us understanding of why the falsehoods are sufficiently, even though involved in the derivation, they're still immaterial from a realist perspective. Now there's actually a good deal of literature on this sort of topic, and people talk about this kind of cohesion problem. What I'm doing here is abstracting, of course. So I say that, well, you can give this more abstract description of the property by having a disjunction or having a vague property that's realized by the specific property involved in the model. And people say that, well, you run into this problem of overgenerating. That you get too many abstract properties that are instantiated by the model for your modeling not to have for your realism not to have any content. Okay. So we should limit the vagueness of abstraction involved in specifying this or thinking about these less specific properties. And the question, the real philosophical question is how can one place natural constraints on that sort of abstraction procedure? And there's a literature on that in connection, for example, with Streven's theory of explanation. One thing that I like to emphasize is this idea that you really have to keep the laws of nature constant when you're thinking about this sort of thing. So, for example, imagine that you have a model of a ball that ends up from here to there. So that's a potential energy going up there, so there's some sort of potential energy barrier. And you have a model that says that, well, the ball has high enough energy, kinetic energy to make it over the hump. Okay. Now, if in reality it quantum tunnels through the hump and doesn't have high enough high enough energy, then your model is not latching onto reality. It's not the case that you can say that, well, the model latches onto the following feature of reality. It either has high enough energy and gets over the hump that way, or it's quantum tunnels. I mean, that's not a feature, that's not a less specific feature that I would say you can appeal to in saying that the model is inferentially vertical. You have to keep the laws of nature fit. But let's say the model says that well, the system has has much higher kinetic energy than it actually has. Okay, your model predicts that it's going to get over the hump. Now, of course, intuitively speaking, it's clear why that sort of falsehood doesn't matter. All that matters is that higher kinetic energy that is required to get over the hump. Any specific value of kinetic energy. Okay, it's the main property of having high enough kinetic energy that matters. If your model specifies some even very high kinetic energy, it would be inferentially vertical. Okay. Now here's the key point about of motivation. So why would one think that this way, developing this intuition further would have anything going for it? Why not appeal to one of the existing frameworks? Well, I complained that the existing frameworks, at least to my mind, don't really illuminate this key question: how do these idealized models, or models that incorporate falsehoods, how are they empirically successful, predictably successful? I'd like to think that there is something doing the heavy lifting here that can give us understanding. Now, what is it? With this idea of going for less specific properties and this notion of inferentially vertical representations, what sort of understanding does that give us? Well, the idea is that, appealing to more general idea about explanation. So people say about scientific explanation more generally, that explanation is often a matter of providing model information. So say, Tim Woodward says that to explain is to answer what if things had been different questions. Michael Stefano says something model along those lines as well. And I'm very sympathetic to that line of thought, that to explain is to provide model information of a certain sort. Now, I think we are providing some model information here, what that's doing the explaining. So basically, the question: how would the predicted result be different had the modeling assumptions been different? Okay. And inferential verticality is motivated by this idea that you are effectively answering this question. So to the extent that you can say that this inferential verticality of a model shows how false assumptions could have been different without undoing the success, without leading to results that would not count as successful, given the contextually specified boundaries of what we take to be an accurate prediction in a given context. Inferential verticality accounts for predicted success to that extent. It shows how the false assumptions were not, how those specific false assumptions were not necessary for the prediction to come out. Okay? And any reasons you can give for thinking that the false assumptions could thus have been different, so as to be also true, and keep the prediction. So really show how, from a realist perspective, how those falsehoods are immaterial to predicted success. Had the model specified the right features of the world, it would have given the same prediction. So it's that sort of modal dimension of it that's meant to give us the understanding here, meant to do the explaining of empirical success here. Okay. Now, okay, plenty of hand waving here. I better stop now, and so we have some time for questions. So there's a lot to be said about the sort of realism that I think one can defend in a very piecemeal way with this. Let's not get into that now. The bottom line is that I'm not saying that we have some sort of recipe for realism that you can just specify in the abstract and then go and apply to models to specify your realist commitments. Rather, you have to apply it in a piecemeal way, and it's fully compatible with some idealizations not being at all amenable to a realist reading. Okay. Now, here are some of the references to these papers I talked about. Now, all I've said, I gave you a very sort of conceptual hand-wavy description of the inference of verticality. In this paper that just came out in Sapienza just a few weeks ago, finally, after 4 years, and that's true. Yeah, so the editors of the special issues, it took a long time to do anything. So anyway, in that paper, I applied the framework, this conceptual framework, to some actual cases from science. So I, for example, talked about internal inconsistencies involved in the derivation of Planck distribution law in the context of old quantum theory, and I looked at some actual scientific cases, actual scientific details that are meant to fit into this model. But for now, let's just talk about the instances. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation. I like, of course, personally the connection between models and inferences. Also because the conferences I chaired, the title is Model-Based Reasoning. And there is an example in my mind of a researcher in ancient geometry, Munna is the name, that he speaks about the co-exact properties of geometrical diagrams. So you, in a non-standard way, you take into account only the co-exact properties and not the false properties. So this is an example of what you are referring to. The first question?
Yeah. I think my question refers to those slides you didn't show. Because my impression with respect to what you were actually saying was that new ideas have kind of an anti-realist implication. So you suggest that what is really crucial is this aspect of inferentially veridical representations, and they may, in all respects which are relevant for a realist perspective, they may differ from each other because inferentially veridical representations. So you seem to suggest that actually we don't need scientific realism at all in order to understand that problem. So but you said that in the last slide you would have suggested that there is some relation to scientific realism. So I'm wondering what that is.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Richard. That's a really good point to clarify. So indeed, it's not my purpose or the aim of this conceptual framework to provide some sort of recipe that would satisfy realism or the realist aspirations by following the recipe automatically. That's not the aim at all. Rather, the aim is to say something about the cases, for example, where think of something that everybody agrees is totally unproblematic for the realist. So some sort of Galilean idealization, say the ideal pendulum, or some sort of model of clocky box sliding down some sort of inclined plane with some little friction on it. Okay? So everybody thinks that, of course, there's no challenge to the realist whatsoever here. And the question is, so how do we best capture those kinds of idealizations from a realist perspective? What's the sense of those models latching onto reality? And Stephen French wants to say perhaps that, well, you have the data model of the honey box sliding down many times, something like that, and then you have a theoretical model, and there's some sort of personalized morphism, and I don't really see how that eliminates the sense in which the model is latching onto reality. I think a better way to think of that is to think of it as a range of possible first functions that you can have describing the system. Okay, and assume that one of the first functions. So you have a range of first functions that give you the results that counts as predicted success by the contextually set criteria. And the idea is that if we have reason to think that the realist idea that the model is latching onto reality can be nicely understood in terms of the idealized model getting right the following feature. The first function just has to be one or another in this range, which includes the actual first function that truly describes the system, which could be incredibly complicated. All of which would have yielded the predicted result. So when applied to models like that, it's meant to illuminate the sense in which the model is lacking into reality. And then it's an open question what comes of it when you apply it to much trickier cases involving something like the topodynamic limits or what have you.
Other questions?
I agree with your point of view, so I want to just propose as a case study this. Of course, whenever we say as physicists that friction is negligible, we mean by that in laboratories we may take special care so as to reduce the effect of friction to a practical extent, and then study motion in these very special conditions. Then what, of course? If in the world outside friction is not negligible, as it is the case on Earth, then we should in the end include friction and understand motion under the effect of friction too. And that's in the end what we did. Nonetheless, of course, once you study friction as a force, you understand that it introduces in the problem a time scale about which friction becomes not negligible. And then you understand why in some situations you can neglect it to practical purposes. For instance, an astronomer should never take the friction into account because the motion of planets around the sun is almost friction. It means that the effect of friction in that case will show up after millions of years. So why take it into account if I have to make prediction for 1 year or 10 years or 100 years? But if I were to make prediction over very, very long period, then I should take into account friction for planets too. So what does exactly mean prediction? This is important. We should say prediction over what time scale. And then, of course, even on a very, very rough surface, there are so short time scales where friction can be neglected. Of course, those are very short, so there is no point in neglecting, because in the end, it will take over.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and it just goes to emphasize the importance of taking this notion of predicting success to be contextual. It's not something given objectively. It's something that, you know, if you require a more accurate prediction, then it isn't successful anymore, because you're saying that we are measuring more precisely, and we want to get a more precise result out of the model.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good points. Yeah, it's accurate.
Yeah, so thanks for the conversation. Just a quick follow-up on the previous point. I think there is some sort of a key word in the pragmatist. The pragmatist sort of perspective on things. When it comes to predictions, it always depends what you are as a scientist, as a user of the theory are interested in. Right? So there's no model will ever give you everything. Right? So if you want certain things, you just use certain models. So yeah, I think that you're looking for, or you're after that account for. But I think an account, someone like on trust and a pragmatist can offer such an account in those terms, right? So the prediction is always contextual, is always a matter of interest, the scientist's interest. So it's in a sense a case-by-case business, right? So maybe you want too much from a theory of science, right? In a sense that you want a general account of how it works. Or maybe it's not.
I don't want a general account of how it works at all. What I'm doing is I'm providing conceptual tools to be applied in a piecemeal way in different cases. What you do, you apply this to something like a frictionless plane case or ideal pendulum or something like that, and then you project. So there's a degree to which you can project your realist commitments by saying that for models like that, for models that have those key features of, say, those types of in principle de-idealizable assumptions, my commitment is that it's in principle theoretical in that sort of sense, which underwrites my realist attitude towards it. even if we never get it, and if we never can do the idealization. It's like, for models like that, I'm committed to that. That's my realist attitude to it. But it's a piecemeal approach in that idealizations and falsehoods in modeling come in many shapes and sizes. So for some other kind of idealization, where you say, for example, take limits to infinity, the idealization has a totally different characteristics. And then you say, perhaps, that for models like that, I'm an instrumentalist. I cannot, I cannot give you a story of why models like that are predictably accurate by virtue of. There may be some other explanation why they're predictably accurate. So it's I'm not trying to provide a recipe that is a theory of, yeah.
I was going to bring up the case study that I'm going to be talking about, which is Newton's use of a reduced model of the solar system in Proposition 11. There's two features of that I think are important for why this model, though it is false, had to be the beginning of rational mechanics in a sense. One is that it's only the two-body problem that's solvable. It really had to start that way. And Newton just barely had the mathematical tools to solve it. And secondly, it's the nature of the solar system. You got one big thing, then you have a very, very few small things, very far away from each other. And that's a really good situation for taking a subsystem and analyzing the subsystem. So, I mean, there's both a sort of discursive, what are the mathematical tools available reason, and the nature of the actual system reason.
Yeah, sure. I look forward to your talk and thinking about it. So let me try and make a related point about how one might, or how I think of idealizations in this context of inferentially vertical evolution system. This is something I didn't really go into because it doesn't really bear on the key message that I want to get across. But imagine now that for this kind of toy example that I talked about, the mathematics, when you present the system in that way, the mathematics is very simple. Analytically solvable. The equation just really nicely lends themselves to the easy way of getting the results out. Had you presented it in that way, you have to go numerical, and it gets really complicated. Okay, that becomes an idealization just by virtue of the fact that mathematics is such that it happens to be much simpler for that sort of thing. So in this kind of toy example setting, this will count as idealization purely by virtue of that. Even though it's the case that, well, if you go and numerically do it with this, you get more or less the same result out.